because they were the remnants that would have formed Israel. And what we see is from Israel past, that even though Israel was a chosen nation, Israel gave God a lot of headache. And to the point where God no longer see them as the whole of Israel, but see the remnants of Israel. And what we find happening now is when Paul addressed the Romans in chapter 11, he addressed it from the point that, look, I am going to I'm going to call the Gentiles into view. I'm going to call them because they are the ones who will make the kingdom. They are the ones that is going to complete God's plan of salvation. And so it is because of the Jewish unbelief and the remnants who believed in God. When the gospel was preached to the Jews first, the remnants responded. Paul had a concern about that. Paul addressed that. And Paul says, in the early part of the chapter, he's talking, and he gave reference to Elijah. And Elijah was talking about how the Jews killed the prophets and the priests and what have you. And God reminded them that, look, I have a remnant of 7,000 who is faithful to me. And because of that, they are the ones who is going to be called into the kingdom. But more so, as he calls them in, he brings the Gentiles into his fold too as well. But there's something about the Gentiles. The Gentiles seems to want to have their own way. They seem to want to boast about their salvation. And we are going to talk a little on that today, about that boasting that they have found themselves in. And so as the chapter comes to a close, Paul addresses the Gentiles, and he is addressed both the Gentiles and the Jew, but he is emphasizing the conduct of the Gentiles, because one of the things that you find happening is that as he addresses the Jews, as he addresses the Gentiles had a lot to learn about salvation. And also they also had to understand where God was coming from, where God was coming from as he brought the Jews and he developed the Jews into a nation for himself, where the gospel and the salvation is going to be projected through. As we turn into chapter number 12, this is what Paul says, and we're going to try to do the first 3 verses as we get into the picture. Now, I will be with you until the end of next month, right? And then a new teacher will take over, right? I'm not sure how his approach is going to be. But that's the roster. So this is what he says here to the Gentiles, and this is what he says. He says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove that which is good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think solely according as God had dealt to every man the measure of faith. What Paul is saying here, as he starts, Paul is addressing the fact that he wants the church at Rome to present themselves. And that presentation means how you stand before God. And how you stand before God determines how you represent God. And what Paul is saying is that Paul is urgently or beseeching them through emotions that, look, I want you to present yourselves. The word here for bodies is the Greek word for soma, which represents the body. So what happens here is that how it works is not that it's not talking, you'll see in some versions will tell you that it talks about the whole body. But the word here represents just the body itself and how you present it. How we present ourselves determines how we represent. How we represent God determines how well we have learned. The more we learn of God and the more we practice God, tells us how we represent him. Let me tell you this. Representation is important. And representation means that how I present myself is how I honor what I'm attached to. For example, we see in a marriage. In a marriage, we have the bride and we have the groom. Usually in our culture, we pay a lot of attention to the bride. How the bride presents herself determines how well the groom is honored. How well the groom is honored means that how well pleased he is. The bride usually is in the form of well-dressed, makeup, everything is on point, everything is matching. And what we see is that it turns out to be her best day and her best moment at the point in time, right? She represents. When we look at the Christian also too represents God. The Christian represents and honors God to a point that, look, this is who I am in this person. And so it is that we have to live our lives in such a way that when we present ourselves, we represent God to the fullest. God is well pleased. The groom is well pleased at the end. So Paul is urgently asking the Romans that you present yourselves as a living sacrifice. Now, let's dig into this word because I want to just spend a little time on this word presentation. And what we see here, Paul appeals to emotion and calls for the Christian to be obedient. The more we learn of God, is the better we can represent God. And Paul is saying that, look, I'm earnestly asking. Paul is not trying to be the dictator that you have to and must. Yes, it included an emotion, but it's a soft touch. And he's begging, he's saying, look, I want you to be the best version of yourself. So I want to lead by example, and I want you to follow in my lead. That in order for you to represent Christ, you must be obedient to his word. So he is exalting them, and he is encouraging them to be obedient so that best representation can take place. When we present ourselves, it means our body is sanctified and it is ready for service. You see, presenting ourselves doesn't come in any form or fashion. It must come with a character. It must come with an attitude. So that when we present ourselves, we must know that, look, our presentation must be able to appeal. It must be able to say something about you. And it must be able to give God the honor that it so deserves. But let me say more than that. When we present ourselves, what we are actually doing, we are giving God worship. We are giving God service when we present ourselves. You see, presenting our bodies must be done in a righteous manner. Look at Romans chapter 6. And look at verse number 12. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lust thereof. Neither yield your members as instrument of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourself unto God, as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. This is how we present our bodies. So when Paul is urging the church to present themselves, he's saying that, look, I want you to present yourself as instruments of righteousness. This is how we stand. So it's just not any old presentation. It is how we stand before God. And so that it means how we represent God in the process. Now, by presenting our bodies in righteousness, we become worship to God in whatever we do. In Proverbs chapter 23 and verse 7, the Bible tells us that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. In order for us to present ourselves as instrument of righteousness, our thought process must be in line with our presentation. Our presentation must be such that how we feed our minds will determine how we represent. So however a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So he presents himself. We got to feed the mind. We got to put the mind in such a position that the mind must be able to control the actions of the body so that it will present itself in such a way that it will represent in righteousness. Let me tell you something about presentation. Usually what happens is when we talk, or as we said just now there, presentation is about worship. And what happens is when we present ourselves, we are actually giving God glory. We are giving him praise. We are giving him worship. And sometimes we have the view that worship is when we come together in a setting like this, corporate type worship or corporate type setting. This is one form of worship. But how we represent ourselves or how we represent God is individually. You see, and when we represent God individually, we give God worship. Let me tell you something about Adam. Adam didn't need to pray. Adam didn't need faith. Adam didn't need to give collection. Adam didn't need to make sacrifice or partake of communion. And for the simple reason, Adam was worship. And Adam had become worship because he was holy, because he was in a holy place. And so it is his action by loving his wife, taking care of her, taking care of the garden, taking care of the words that God had presented to him. That was worship. And so when we present ourselves, not only in this setting, but when we present ourselves, when we go outside, whatever we do, we give worship. You see, the way how I conduct myself, when I talk to you, when I do it in the spirit of love, when I keep myself from immorality and emotional affairs, when I love my spouse, when I pay homage to the poor, when I treat men fairly, what I am doing, I am worshiping God. And I'm giving God the service that he so rightfully deserves. You see, because my presentation must be about giving glory. And in giving glory, it means that I have to do the things that God had asked me to do. You see, unless I don't give myself to the purpose of God, then I cannot give God worship. Then I am not presenting myself to represent God like the bride. But God wants us to do that. God wants us to give him the glory. Now, there's another part to this verse. He said, present yourself as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable, which is your reasonable service. Now, our presentation must be done in sacrifice. And it's a sacrifice that really gives us the drive to really make that difference in how we do things and get things done. You see, when we look at the book of Genesis, and in chapter number 22, the writer says about Abraham and his son Isaac. And Isaac, in fact, Abraham took his son, Isaac, as he was commanded by God, to go and sacrifice his only son. Now, that's a hard stuff. That's a hard thing to do. And let me tell you what made it difficult. God had promised Adam a son. What I said? Sorry. Abraham. God had promised Abraham a son. And Abraham, when God made that promise to him, Abraham was around 75 years old when he made that promise. When God called Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac was about 22 years old. So when you add it up, 75 years, he had Isaac when he was 100 years. And when Isaac was 22 years, God made the call for him to sacrifice him. So in all, when we add the figures, we're looking at about 47 years. I have waited since that promise, 47 years, and now you're telling me to go and sacrifice my son. But what we see is obedience. Let me just read a little. Let's read the first 3 verses in Genesis 22. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I shall tell thee. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went into the place which God had told him. The stage is set that God is now calling Abraham to sacrifice his son. Now, nowhere we see here where Abraham made a fuss. Abraham obeyed God and decided that, look, I'm going to do what the Lord asked me to do. It might be hard, but he understood who God is. He understood who he was representing. And he understood that, look, whatever God may do in taking the life of this son, God is going to compensate. And this is what we are seeing here in the picture. That God, he moves with obedience. And we see that in chapter number 4 of Romans, right? That Abraham moved with faith. But more importantly, he took his people, he took all that was necessary in order to make that burnt offering happen. So it right away tells you that Abraham was set to sacrifice his son. And to do that, and to make that happen, it takes a relationship, a deep relationship, for you to move with that type of faith. That is not something that will, if I ask you to do that, you will want to know if I am mad. And sometimes it's because of the relationship that we have tells us what I am prepared to do for you. You see, because a relationship means, or is a driving force in an individual life. You see, because what I may do for you, as we have a good and strong relationship, if the request is made from somebody else, I may be a little more hesitant. And relationship tells how I'm going to respond to you. There's no hard and fast rule to it, because some people do things for strangers, they risk their life for strangers, right? But what I'm saying is that it has to do with relationship. You see, and if we love God, we love people. And if we love people, and my action means that I'm making a sacrifice for you, is because of my relationship with me and my God. It's not because of what is, not because of you and me. It's because me and God prompts me to move in a way that will make me make a deep sacrifice for you. Yes, sis.
come to our Christ. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to do it. Because we know that we have to No. Or the release of the grass. From this everything is done and everything hard. And he will have strength. When he goes into the empty heart. And if whatever he is not right, when they very one glass for the moment, right. So that's pretty physical sense in this aspect and this aspect. But in physical sense, it about transforming your mind, change your life, and we want to do strength. And so we sacrifice this when we get back. It's the marriage of your life. No, you mean strong. Only what they do. I don't think sometimes you realize the seriousness. And you see, the same thing as we should when we get baptized is I'm talking about prison. I don't know if the first falls on more than that. And if they are marriage and ups and downs in a marriage, the spark what? The time was let go. Same as no matter what we do, God, that's why I'm saying, there's something to go or there's one something to do. Yes. As we go for there's something to do, there's something to go. And it's like what we do. That's what it was on hand. And so when this marriage is finished.
That's my question.
So marriage has serious step. And even though we have our role on the surface, they're keep us apart. That's a serious answer. How do you think we will realize serious things like
Let me say one thing that I will add to what you say. Now, in a relationship depends on how much you put into it. The more I put into a relationship, the stronger the relationship becomes. So a relationship is like an investment, right? And the more I put into it, is the more returns I get from it. And I do it because of willingness. I want to do it. Now, the more I expose myself to you, is the more I am going to share of myself, the more I'm going to expose of myself. And the more I expose and the more we interact, there's a deep sense of commitment that goes with it or flows with it. Now, this in itself does determine how I respond to you. You see, because if I build my relationship with God, and as I build my relationship with God, that's the first connection that I have. The scriptures tell me how to love God and how to build that relationship with him. But it doesn't stop there. It also teaches me how to love myself. It also teaches me how to love you. And when the Bible concludes that, look, love your neighbor as you love yourself. A lot of people just look at the neighbor, love your neighbor. But you've got to love your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you don't love yourself, then how could I love you if I don't love myself? How could I build a relationship? Because I have to want to sacrifice for me too. You see? I can't want good for you and not want for me. You follow what I'm saying? And so I will have to also too, as I build a relationship within me and within myself, I strengthen my bond within myself. But we're going to talk a little about that. Maybe, yeah, I'm coming to it. So I'm going to build a bond with me, so I could be able to do the things that is necessary in order to get done. Yes, brother.
And then I'll see what I want to see. They say, if I don't love myself, then how will I love me back? Simple, if I love myself.
Yeah.
Actually, my love was them. But I owe you gave. So they had.
Right.
Yeah, but you know, let's say that. If it shouldn't be the ideal thing, but let's say that would already happen. Right. And if I go to Rachel question, you will find the point she made about the husband and so on, right? And you know, the relationship and the love and the sacrifice and things, right? You will find that according to, and you see the three scriptures you started in Romans 12, say that it says that you present your body a living sacrifice. Then you went into Romans 6 and it talk about the nature of the sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Then you went to Genesis, talk about Abraham and Isaac. And you finish what I'm going to say with the serpent. But I'm getting the point I'm making here.
All right, that's what you bring.
Yeah, I'm finish what I'm going to say quickly in that what happens is, especially in the 21st century, brethren, we don't teach much contemporary history, and brethren don't understand a lot of things. So that's a problem. Because when we talk about to present your body a living sacrifice, the first thing about a sacrifice is it dead. And the first thing about sacrifice dead. Abraham was carrying Isaac to kill him. It's all them nice word, all them like, all them want the back to it. But when we say a sacrifice, we go and kill it. Right? So
Well, take my point already.
So my point is, if the sacrifice is dead, what God is saying, you see, this fallen flesh, right, cannot obey God unless you kill it. So if you go to Romans 8 now, you're past that already, right? He says that if you mortify the body, you will be able to walk with spirits. But if you don't kill this body, you cannot be spiritual. Because when you say present your body a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable, the Greek means spiritual sacrifice. Reasonable means spiritual. You cannot present a spiritual sacrifice to God unless you die. When you say, and when you go to the hospital, like I had that too, like when the first time I passed by the mortuary, she put me in where I was mortuary. So I see this man come out in a white gown with a doctor, and he said, I'm comfortable, I mean, before my constable, I'm coming in the family, sure. When I go in there, the man have 5 body open up. I never see a dead body before. You have 5 open up. You know, and while I boss one so pull up the whole face, boss here, quack, open it up, take out the whole inside of it and I start up this up. I free. Right? Because I never see that. And me and my vial, because I put a level and we can hold it. I never free as that. But I'm very shocked for me. Right? So what is it presented but it's a living sacrifice? And this flesh loves sin. This flesh does not say no be sin. So if you kill your natural desires, it's there. Whatever you're going to do. Right? So that no sense for it. I mean, you're trying over. So, yeah, you say what I say. You need to make people here. And you pass a team, you will find that what will happen. Whether you're married or not, and a real nice lady, but a man will be attracted to her. The only reason he's going after because I'm married is he made a commitment to his wife. He didn't make a commitment. So he just saying, I let you go because I'm committed to you. But it doesn't mean, well, I'm married now, I feel left again. I'm going that don't happen. So the sacrifice you make when you kill the mortal flesh is what helps you to wake up and stay. In the 21st century, we don't understand sacrifice, so we don't like to make it. Men want, you see the sweet little 18-year-old married, he wants at 46, he's still the sweet 18-year-old. You know, here we are actually growing all kind of direction. Me too.
Yeah.
It's easy to have that woman. It's hard to keep one people for a lifetime. No, not for a lifetime. I thought that was a good point.
Right. But into some other stuff. That's not what I'm saying.
Yes.
We're not building a particular direction. Right. And I was telling you about Abraham. and the sacrifice of his son.
You know that right now. I don't want to get you real. It's not 8 minutes, but I will keep it in mind and we'll talk about it. Right?
Abraham was ordered to go and sacrifice. And I was telling you about the sacrifice that was made. It was made as a result of the relationship that God had with Abraham. Now, what I want us to look at too is from verse number 8. And Abraham, okay, let's pick it up from verse 7, just to get the context and for it to make sense. Genesis chapter 22 and verse number 7. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father, and he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told them of. And Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay him. And the angel of the Lord called him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And in verse 12, he says, And he said, Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. It is about relationship. But what we see here, everything was prepared. The altar was built, the wood was set, Isaac was on the wood, and he and Abraham was now going to sacrifice his son as God had asked him to. But what we see in this picture, it was a test of faith to show us how much faith Abraham had in God in order to reach to that point of killing his son. If God didn't stop him, he would have killed him. I keep that in mind. If God did not stop Abraham, he would have killed him. If God didn't stop Abraham, he would have killed Isaac, his son. But what I want us to see, and as we develop the point, when God stopped him and Isaac came off the altar, Isaac is now a living sacrifice. Now, it can be looked at in different applications. But in this application, I want us to see that now that Abraham has released his son from the altar, he is no longer that sacrifice that is to be made. But he is a sacrifice that now, when death came at his doorstep and God released him, Isaac walked as a living sacrifice. The same thing we could say about Jesus. And so it is when we die to sin, we also too become living sacrifice for God, because now we are dead to sin and no longer serve sin. Our intention is not to serve sin. Let's look at Galatians chapter 2, and then we will seek to wrap up with this. Verse 20, Galatians chapter 2 and verse number 20. This is what Paul says to the Galatians. He says, I am crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. It is because of what Christ did on the cross. By dying for my sins, I have the opportunity now to walk with God as a living sacrifice. God spared not his son, and his son became a living sacrifice so that you and I will have the opportunity to walk with God as living sacrifice. You see, we have to remember that as we present ourselves, we got to understand what we are presenting, how we are presenting, where we are presenting, and when we are presenting. We got to understand these things, because it is these things that will help us to understand our walk with God. Because our presentation is worship to God. But when we go into verse number 2, we're going to talk about the mind and how we need to feed the mind in order that the body will be able to make a presentation that will stand before God, and honorably so. If we don't stand before God, or if we don't present ourselves in a way where God takes preeminence, then our sacrifice could be in vain. Just remember, presentation is important. Presentation is what brings honor and glory to God. Okay. I see my time is up, and I got to